At 9:47 on a Friday evening, Pope Leo XIV closed the leather folder and placed both hands flat on the table. The room was one of the smaller reception chambers on the second floor of the Apostolic Palace. Sealed from the corridors outside with no windows, one crucifix on the wall behind him, and 2 Swiss guards standing beyond the closed door. Inside, only 3 people remained: the Pope, the Cardinal, and Archbishop Giovanni Battaglini. The canonical witness asked to watch what was about to happen. 5 days earlier, the Cardinal sitting across from Leo had controlled one of the most powerful offices in the Roman Curia. He sat on 4 separate boards, oversaw financial disbursements worth hundreds of millions of euros each year, and had survived every restructuring, every reform attempt, and every change of pontificate since Pope Benedict XVI. He had spent decades learning how power moved through Rome. Tonight, that power was no longer protecting him. The Cardinal had not moved in almost a full minute. The leather folder sat between them like a sentence already written, thick with records, names, accounts, dates, and witness statements that had passed through Vatican hands before he ever entered the room. Pope Leo looked at him without raising his voice and said the words that ended the last illusion of control. "This conversation is over." No one outside that chamber saw the moment happen. There was no camera, no public warning, no staged investigation, and no committee standing between the Pope and the man he was removing. But by Saturday morning, pieces of the confrontation were already leaking through Vatican back channels, and by Monday, Rome understood the scale of what had taken place. A cardinal who had been considered untouchable had been stripped of everything in person: his boards. His financial access, his influence, and his future inside the Vatican had all collapsed inside a room with no windows. The question was no longer whether Pope Leo XIV was willing to confront power. The question was how long he had been watching, what he had found, and who inside the Roman Curia would be next. To understand what happened inside that sealed room, Rome first had to understand who the Cardinal had been before Pope Leo XIV closed the folder. He was 73 years old, Italian, and a career Vatican diplomat who had spent more than 3 decades inside the Roman Curia. He was not a sudden scandal figure. He was part of the structure. He had served under 3 different pontificates, without ever being publicly questioned, publicly challenged, or publicly disciplined. He had been created cardinal under Pope Benedict XVI and had survived every reform attempt that followed. Popes changed. Offices were renamed. Inside the Secretariat of State, officials described him in almost identical terms. One called him the man who could stop any reform with a single phone call. Another called him the gatekeeper. A third said what many had understood for years but rarely said aloud: everyone owed him something. His authority was not only administrative, it was structural. He controlled access points, decided which proposals reached which desks, and sat on oversight committees for charitable funds that operated with minimal external scrutiny. Over the years, he had built a web of relationships and dependencies so dense that opposing him carried professional consequences. People learned which files slowed down, which proposals disappeared, and which appointments never moved forward when his office was crossed. That was how power worked around him, quietly and without fingerprints. For decades, that system made him functionally untouchable, or at least that was what he believed. Pope Leo had been watching him since February. First concrete evidence came in early June. A routine internal audit, part of the quiet accountability system Pope Leo had been building since the first months of his pontificate, flagged unusual patterns inside the disbursement records of a charitable fund linked to the Cardinal's office. On paper, the irregularities did not look dramatic at first. That was what made them dangerous. Payments had been routed through intermediary accounts in ways that obscured their final destination. Donations had arrived from sources that could not be independently verified through standard Vatican channels. Certain amounts did not match the charitable purposes listed beside them, and the explanations attached to those transfers were clean enough to pass quickly unless someone decided to slow down. The auditors were not a large public commission. They were a small team working under the prefecture of the economy. 3 laypeople and 1 Monsignor. Trained to notice patterns that powerful offices often expected others to ignore, they did not accuse the Cardinal immediately. They gathered the numbers, marked the routes, and followed the movement of money through channels that had been designed to look ordinary. When the preliminary findings were ready, the auditors brought them to Archbishop Giovanni Battista Aglini, the Vatican's compliance coordinator. Battaglini did not treat the report as office gossip or administrative noise. He took the data away and began checking it himself, line by line, account by account. For 4 full days, he cross-referenced account numbers, examined disbursement timing, and tracked the intermediary organizations attached to the fund. The longer he worked, the harder the pattern became to explain as confusion or clerical error. By the end of the review, the problem was no longer a suspicious audit flag. It was a map. On Tuesday, June 16th, Battaglini brought the findings directly to Pope Leo XIV. There was no broad meeting, no committee presentation, and no long chain of officials allowed to soften the conclusion before it reached the Pope's desk. The evidence moved quietly through the Vatican, and then it stopped in front of the one man who could decide what came next. Battaglini had spent 4 days turning fragments into a sequence. By the time he entered the Pope's office on Tuesday, June 16th, he was no longer carrying an audit concern. He was carrying evidence that pointed into the center of a powerful curial office. Pope Leo read the summary in less than 10 minutes. He did not interrupt Battaglini with theories, and he did not ask who else had seen it. He moved through the pages in silence, then stopped at the section where the earliest confirmed transactions began to form a repeated pattern. He asked one question. How long has this been happening? Battaglini's answer was careful, but it changed the room. The patterns they could confirm went back to at least 2019. The structural conditions that allowed them to happen may have existed much longer. Leo said nothing for several seconds. The silence did not feel like hesitation. It felt like the moment before a decision became operational. Then he gave Battaglini the order. Bring everything, every record, every transaction, every name. From that point forward, the investigation would no longer move like routine oversight. It would move like a sealed Vatican operation. For the next 48 hours, only 4 people knew what was happening. Pope Leo himself, Archbishop Becciu, the head of the Vatican's Office of the Auditor General, and one canon lawyer from the dicastery for legislative texts worked inside a circle small enough to prevent warning from traveling. Through the Curia, no emails were sent. No digital communications were used. Everything moved on paper. They worked from a secure room inside the governorate building, away from the cardinal's usual corridors and the offices where his influence still reached. Physical files were hand-delivered between trusted offices. Documents were reviewed, marked, checked, and returned before anyone outside that narrow circle could understand that a powerful man's career was already being measured page by page. By Thursday evening, June 18th, the sealed investigation had produced a dossier that ran to more than 200 pages. It included financial records spanning 7 years, transfer histories from 14 different accounts, and witness statements from 3 former employees of the Cardinal's office. Each document added weight to the same conclusion. The correspondence was the most damaging, showed that the Cardinal had personally directed the routing of funds through specific channels, not once and not by accident. The pattern was organized, repeated, and protected by the kind of administrative language that made misconduct look like procedure. The money had not been diverted for obvious personal luxury. That was why the scheme had survived for so long. The Cardinal lived modestly by Vatican standards, and no one had been looking for a man buying villas, cars, or visible comfort. What the dossier showed was more dangerous. Charitable funds had been channeled into a network of influence. Payments to external consultants who appeared to perform no real consulting work. Grants to organizations that existed mostly on paper, registered addresses tied to empty offices or private residences. And stipends to individuals whose main function seemed to be creating distance between the Cardinal's office and the final recipients. It was not crude theft. It was the construction of a parallel power structure inside the Church, funded by resources meant for the poor and vulnerable. By the time Pope Leo read the final summary alone in his private study on Thursday night, the question was no longer whether something had happened. The question was how much of Rome had learned to live around it. Pope Leo read the final summary alone in his private study on Thursday night. According to a source who spoke with someone present the following morning, he appeared to have slept very little. His desk held an empty coffee cup, and the dossier closed, but clearly studied, with several pages marked by small paper tabs. By Friday morning, June 19th, his voice was steady. At 7:15, he told Archbishop Battaglini to schedule a meeting for that night at 9 o'clock. In the East reception room, the message to the cardinal would be simple. The Pope wished to discuss administrative matters related to the quarterly review. The cardinal accepted the invitation without suspicion. He had met Pope Leo in similar settings several times over the past year, and nothing in the wording suggested danger. To him, it sounded routine. It was not routine. At 9 o'clock that evening, the cardinal arrived at the Apostolic Palace. Vatican gendarme escorted him through the second-floor corridor to the East reception room. When he entered, Pope Leo was already seated at the table, and Archbishop Battaglini stood near the far wall, holding the thick leather folder. The Pope did not stand to greet him. He did not offer pleasantries, ask about his health, or make small talk about the weather in Rome. He looked directly at the cardinal and spoke with the cold calm of a man who had already read every page. "I know what you have been doing," he said. The cardinal's expression changed. One source said he went pale, another said he froze, and a third said his jaw tightened visibly. What they all agreed on was that he tried to respond, opening his mouth as if to ask a question or begin a defense. Pope Leo raised one hand, palm outward. The gesture was small but absolute. "Do not," he said. "I did not invite you." Here tonight to argue, Archbishop Battaglini stepped forward and placed the dossier on the table between the two men. It was 214 pages thick, filled with financial records, witness statements, account numbers, routing histories, dates, and amounts marked in yellow. The cardinal looked at it, but he did not open it. He stared at the folder as if refusing to touch it could slow down what was already happening. Pope Leo watched him without anger. His voice stayed measured, almost conversational, but every word carried the full weight of papal authority. "Effective immediately," Leo said, "you are relieved of all curial responsibilities. Your membership on every board and commission under your purview is revoked. Your access to Vatican financial systems is terminated as of this moment. Your faculties as a cardinal are suspended pending a full canonical review." The room went completely silent. No one moved. Air conditioning hummed softly. And somewhere beyond the closed chamber, a vehicle crossed the courtyard. But inside the room, the cardinal sat as if the sentence had not yet reached him. For 15 to 20 seconds, he stared at Pope Leo. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked toward Battaglini, who stood motionless beside the table, and then back at the Pope. "You cannot do this," the cardinal said. His voice was thin and strained, as though his throat had tightened around the words. "Not like this. Not without a process. Not without." Pope Leo leaned forward less than an inch. It was barely movement, but it changed the pressure in the room. "I just did." With those 3 words, one of the most entrenched power structures inside the Vatican ceased to exist. No committee vote had preceded it. No public investigation had given the cardinal time to rally allies. And no intermediary had delivered the message from a safe distance. It was surgical, total, and done in person. After delivering the pronouncement, Pope Leo did not dismiss the cardinal immediately. He stayed seated across from him for another 20 minutes, not to negotiate the decision, but to make sure the man understood what had been destroyed and why. The Pope spoke quietly about duty, service, and the millions of faithful who trusted the Church with their money, their hopes, and their belief that sacred offices still existed for something higher than self-preservation. "The resources of this Church belong to the poor," Leo said at one point. "They belong to the sick. They belong to the forgotten. They do not belong to us. They were never ours to redirect." The cardinal said very little. He sat still, looked down at the table, and seemed to understand that the evidence had left him with almost no room to move. At one point, he asked the only practical question left to ask: "Will there be a public announcement?" Leo's answer was careful. "That depends entirely on you. There is a path here that preserves what can still be preserved. I suggest you take it." The implication was unmistakable. Silence could preserve a measure of dignity, a quiet departure, a voluntary resignation, health concerns, advanced age, perhaps even a retreat into contemplative life. Public resistance would turn the file on the table into a storm that neither the cardinal nor the institution could control. But the cardinal made a catastrophic mistake. He left the meeting, returned to his Vatican apartments, and within 3 hours, before midnight, on that same Friday, called 3 other cardinals by telephone. He described the confrontation as overreach, a power grab, and a personal vendetta by an American pope who did not understand how Rome had always worked. He was not accepting the path Leo had offered. He was building a coalition, or trying to. By Saturday morning, every one of those conversations had been reported back to the Pope's office. Not because Leo had ordered surveillance, but because the 3 cardinals he called had each decided that their loyalty lay somewhere else. Pope Leo's response was immediate, precise, and devastating in its simplicity. He instructed the Vatican press office to prepare a formal statement, not a full financial accounting, because the canonical process would handle that in due course. The statement would confirm that a senior cardinal had been relieved of all curial responsibilities effective immediately pending investigation into grave financial irregularities within offices under his direction. The statement was released Saturday at noon Rome time. It contained no name, but this was Rome, and Rome did not need a name to understand who had fallen. Within less than 90 minutes, the cardinal's identity had moved through newsrooms, diplomatic offices, religious houses, and Vatican corridors with the speed of a verdict. Italian media broke the story before 1 o'clock. International outlets followed by evening. Vatican correspondents who had been tracking whispers for weeks suddenly had official confirmation, and the switchboard at the Holy See press office was overwhelmed with calls. But the more important reaction did not come from journalists. It came from inside the Vatican itself. The 3 cardinals he had called on Friday night issued a joint statement on Saturday afternoon, and it did not defend him. They did not criticize the Pope. They did not call for caution, delay, or public sympathy. They simply said they trusted fully in the Holy Father's judgment and pastoral discernment, and that they were praying for everyone affected by the developments. In Vatican language, that was not support for a colleague. It was abandonment. Quiet, diplomatic, carefully worded, and absolute. By Sunday morning, the cardinal had left Vatican City entirely. He retreated to a private residence outside Rome, reportedly belonging to a family member, while the office he had once controlled was sealed by Vatican gendarme. The door closed, the files stayed inside, and the machinery that had protected him for decades stopped moving in his direction. His staff, 7 people in total, were reassigned to other departments. His nameplate was removed, his access credentials were deactivated, and his name disappeared from the directory of active curial officials. In less than 60 hours, a career spanning 3 decades had been erased from the functional structure of the Catholic Church. The man who had once controlled access, money, committees, and favors had discovered that his network could not survive the moment the Pope made neutrality impossible. Rome had watched a gatekeeper lose every gate, but Pope Leo was not finished. On Sunday evening, while the media storm was building and the stripped cardinal was retreating from public view, Leo made a call that shifted the crisis beyond one man. He contacted Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle of Manila. The conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes. Its full substance was not disclosed, but one question from Leo became the center of what followed. "If we clean only one room," the Pope reportedly asked, "what message does that send about the rest of the house?" Tagle, an heretic, heretically, "The halt has got all that." It was about the system that had produced him, structures that had enabled him, and the culture that had allowed financial misdirection to continue beneath the surface of institutional respectability. On Monday morning, Pope Leo convened a full meeting of the Council of Cardinals, the advisory body often referred to inside Rome as the C9. The official agenda concerned ongoing reforms of curial financial oversight. But sources present in the room said Leo opened the session by moving immediately beyond the fallen cardinal. He stood at the head of the table, looked at each cardinal in turn, and made the case bigger than one office. "This church will not tolerate parallel structures," he said, "not financial ones, not political ones, not personal ones. Every office that exists within this institution exists to serve." No one answered because everyone in the room understood that the Pope was no longer describing a scandal. He was defining the future boundary of power inside the Roman Curia. The silence lasted at least 10 seconds. Then Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo of Kinshasa broke it with a direct question. "Holy Father, what do you need from us?" Leo's answer was immediate. Transparency, complete and immediate. Every dicastery, every fund, every account, and every external relationship involving the movement of money, had to be reviewed, documented, and reported within 90 days. A comprehensive financial audit of the entire Roman Curia was now underway, with no exceptions. Sources said at least 2 additional offices had already flagged irregularities to auditors in the days after the Monday announcement. Whether those irregularities would rise to the level of the Cardinal's dossier remained unclear, but the message had already landed. What made the episode different was not simply the discovery of financial misconduct. The Vatican had faced financial scandals before. From the Banco Ambrosiano affair in the 1980s to the London property case that led to the trial of Cardinal Angelo Becciu, which concluded in 2023. What changed under Leo was the speed, the directness, and the personal nature of the confrontation. From the first audit flag to the Cardinal's removal, less than 2 weeks had passed. Leo did not wait for months of managed delay, did not build pressure through leaks, and did not hide behind a commission. He gathered evidence, confirmed facts, checked the canonical path, and then sat across from the man himself. That choice told Rome exactly what kind of pontificate this was becoming. Pope Leo could have sent a letter, delegated the removal to a prefect, or allowed institutional distance to soften the human cost of the decision. Instead, he chose to carry that cost himself. To watch the Cardinal's face change, to hear his voice strain, and to witness the moment when one of the Vatican's most powerful men understood that his power was gone. There was one final detail from that Friday night that remained quieter than the public storm. After the Cardinal left the room, Pope Leo stayed seated at the table while Archbishop Battaglini gathered the dossier. Battaglini asked if there was anything else the Pope needed, any calls to make, any instructions for the morning, and Leo only shook his head. For almost a full minute, the Pope said nothing. His hands remained flat on the table, and his eyes stayed fixed somewhere beyond the room itself. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. I did not enjoy that. I wish it had not been necessary, but I would do it again tomorrow if it were. That was the image Rome did not see. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not a pope celebrating the fall of a powerful man, but a leader carrying the cost of the decision he had refused to delegate. Accountability had not arrived with applause. It had arrived in a windowless room with a leather folder, a canonical witness, and a pope willing to look power in the eye. The investigation would continue for months, and the canonical review would decide what formal penalties came next. But the Cardinal's career inside the Vatican was already finished. Every official in the Roman Curia now understood the message with a clarity they had not possessed 1 week earlier. Pope Leo XIV does not bluff, he does not posture, does not threaten through intermediaries, does not give second chances to men who use the Church's resources to build private empires. When he decides to act, he acts completely, directly, and irreversibly. Days later, a photograph appeared from inside Vatican City. It showed Leo walking alone through the Cortella di San Damaso in the early morning light, dressed in a simple white cassock with no entourage visible around him. It was not staged, and that was why it mattered. It captured a man walking through the quiet space between decision and consequence. That was the Pope Rome never saw coming. The Augustinian from Chicago, shaped far from Vatican power, now commanding it with a softness that made the force behind it even harder to ignore. The 90-day audit clock was already ticking inside the Curia. The next confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was already taking shape behind the bronze doors.